Okay, so we defined benthos as the bottom dwellers. So either in the coastline or way down deep in the ocean, several kilometers deep in the high pressure water. So the benthos are defined into or classified into epifauna, which live on the surface of the sea floor. Fauna is animals, right? In fauna, they bury themselves into the clay, the mud, the sediment that's at the bottom of the ocean. And nectobenthos, which act like crawl or swim through the water just above the seafloor. We will see some examples of those. So benthos are most abundant in shallower water because remember that we said coastlines are incredibly productive because you have a lot of nutrients coming from land as rivers and runoff. You have enough light because they are shallow, and you have winds that are causing upwelling, also bringing nutrients up, right? So benthos is quite abundant in the shallow water. Many lives live in perpetual cold, dark, still waters. Remember when we looked at the currents? We said the bottom waters of the ocean move just a few kilometers per year. You can't even measure them directly. So these waters are very still. Okay, so here are some examples like these attached to the bottom look like tube worms. You can see some barnacles here, sea urchin, clams, and so on. Starfish here, crab here, some worms that have buried themselves into the sand. This is called some kind of a crab that actually stays buried inside as opposed to this crab which is on top. Okay, so this is kind of shallow coastal water, but you can also find life that goes very deep in the ocean. I'll show an example of what happens. Let's say a massive whale which has tons and tons of flesh that can be eaten dies and falls to the bottom of the ocean. Who eats it? You'll see that there are many snaky looking things that keep chewing on this whale meat, and eventually microbes come in and eat whatever remains, and then some other microbes can chew into the bone, and the whole thing gets destroyed over time. But that is a lot of food that comes down to the bottom of the ocean. The other interesting habitat in the benthos is the hydrothermal vent that I already mentioned. You can see some tube worms here at a hydrothermal vents. They were discovered in the deep ocean. Hydrothermal vents were discovered in 1977. It turns out that there are many in Galapagos, in Baja California. There are hydrothermal vents in many places, which is related again to tectonic activities. That's where the toxic stuff can come from within the bottom of the ocean into the water column, right? So they're associated with hot vents, so energy has to come from below. And there are bacteria like archaeons that produce food by using heat and chemicals. So remember, there is no light here, so there is no photosynthesis, but there is chemosynthesis. So we will look at the chemosynthesis equation later on in the next chapter. Okay, so let's take a look at the number of marine species. Here is something interesting. You can bring back your concepts of how the ocean changes, and something we repeated several times, that the ocean has a very high heat capacity, so its temperature changes slowly, right? And we said its salinity doesn't change a lot except in hypersaline lagoons and so on, where seasonal cycle can be very large because it's shallow waters, can rain during one season and can evaporate during another season and so on. So the marine environment doesn't change a lot except at the bottom. Okay, how does that relate to the number of marine species? Compared to the very rapid and very quick changes on land because of the low heat capacity, out of the total catalog species of about 1.8 million, this number will keep increasing because we discover new species every year. And so many more species are not yet identified because we haven't explored all of the heavy rainforests or the deep ocean. So almost 2,000 new marine and terrestrial species are discovered each year. So this number will keep growing. There was something called a consensus of marine life, COML, that was done in the last previous decade with a budget of $650 million, and it discovered all these species. So you can see that the numerous species, you can see the different heights of these bars. Okay, so the challenge is always to understand what determines the biodiversity or the number of species in a different place. So this is just marine mammals. These are the different types of sharks. These are mollusks, birds, yes, birds that predominantly live on marine resources are called seabirds. Okay, and shrimp and lobsters. So you can see the global variations in the number of species. Since the land is highly variable, you expect that most of the species will be found on land, so number of marine species will be much smaller because of this relatively uniform temperatures and salinities that do not change so fast, right? So life evolves to fit into environmental niches. Something happens like a meteorite crash or an earthquake or whatever else that changes conditions for a longish period, or an invasive species that you move from one location to another. Then if new environmental niches, new temperature, new salinity, etc. evolve, new level of light, etc., then new species evolve. So as Darwin said, it's not the strongest species, it's not the smartest species, but it's the most adaptive species that survives, right? So ocean this way ends up with very few environmental niches and much fewer species. So less adaptation is required, and less speciation, evolution of new species from existing species happens. So marine species are overwhelmingly benthic. So if you take all the marine species, then 98% of them are on the bottom because, as you can imagine, the water column cannot change very fast, but the bottom still changes very fast. So 98% of all marine species are at the bottom, and only about 2% are in the water column. Okay. To look at another weird evolution, this is called a Yeti crab, which lives near these hydrothermal vents, which are spewing toxic sulfur, very hot water, no light, very low oxygen, and so on. This Yeti crab has this strange hair growth on its claws. It actually hosts a lot of bacteria on these hairs, and those bacteria help the crab to digest the poisonous chemicals and minerals it ingests. It eats whatever is available, which are actually poisonous, but it has these symbiotic bacteria which convert that toxic material into food it can digest. That's how amazing evolution is. How these things happen? Obviously over a very long time, and it's not easy for us to imagine such long time scales. Extinctions can happen on very short time scales, but evolution, we are not sure how quickly it can happen. There is some evidence that maybe it can happen in one generation. This is important because under global warming we want to know how many species are going extinct and how many species are managing to adapt to the changing conditions because of human activities, right? So there may be some relation between how quickly species have adapted to changing conditions and how quickly they can adapt to global warming and so on. So this is a complicated topic.